Hey there everyone, and welcome back to the Bimmer Barn. Today I'm going to be giving you a full overview of my 335i Wagon build from start to finish, and this is a 2007 325xi Wagon. This car was barely running when we got it and had tons of fault codes on the dashboard. The car had 200,000 miles and it had so many problems, it was time to do an engine swap. Now, my donor car was a 2008 335i. I picked this thing up for a great deal as well. The problem with this car was that it was only running on 3 cylinders. And funny enough, this 335i also had 200,000 miles, but it came with its own sets of problems. And the biggest one when I got it was the Mosfet failure, which I thought we could possibly fix. So we actually pulled out the MSD80 DME, we tested the Mosfets and ended up replacing all of them, but for some reason it did not revive my DME. So we ended up going with an MSD81 upgrade, and I would recommend that you guys do this if you have an N54 powered car that is pre-2008. There's a certain production month where you can find out if your car has this old DME or not. But like I said, once we figured out that issue, we could start investing more time in the motor. We pulled the valve cover off as well as the spark plugs to just see how this car was treated, if there was any oil buildup underneath the valve cover. But to my surprise, I found that there wasn't anything indicating that this motor was mistreated. We also did a compression test before even buying the car, and I found good compression across all the cylinders, and so that gave me the confidence to start this engine swap for real. And so of course we had to start off by removing the old N52 motor. Now, like I said, we're going to be doing a rear wheel drive conversion on this chassis, and the chassis of the Xdrive cars is very different than the rear wheel drive cars. So it's not as easy as just putting the motor in, but rather the subframes are different, the actual frame itself is different, so the transmission tunnel isn't going to fit the same way. So there's something to be aware of when you're doing this swap, is it's not just as easy as it seems on the surface. I really started noticing this when disassembling the 335i, noticing things like the brake lines being different, which you wouldn't necessarily think, but it does make sense being that the DSC module is completely different on the 335i versus the Xdrive cars. So we're going to get to that in a minute, but first we need to focus on getting the N54 motor out, and especially taking all the little bits and pieces and brackets with it that we're going to need for the conversion. And also, while the motor's out, it's going to be a lot easier to service the engine for what I would consider phase 1 of this build, and that is just getting the engine to run inside the car, remove some of the faults, make sure that we have a solid drivetrain before we go into doing some of the modifications for power and for the rod bearings and the turbos like you'll see later. So phase 1, we wanted to take care of the most important things, such as the intake valves, which were very clogged up on this car. There was plenty of carbon buildup, which tells me it's been over 50,000 miles, maybe 100,000 miles since someone's done it on this car. Luckily, I like to use a little bit of Jerryman's injector cleaner, and this is a great way of cleaning off the gunk at home. It doesn't require a walnut blaster or any special equipment, but it gives you a really good polish on the valves. So after we had the motor all cleaned up, we could start to work on the braking system, and this was really important that we do while the motor was out, because the brake lines go around the back of the engine bay, and those would be really hard to change out with the engine inside of the car. So if you want a true rear-wheel drive car, you're not only going to have to change out the axles and also the 335i brakes, which are bigger, but you're also going to need to change out the brake lines, which are shaped differently, and then the module itself, which is wired completely differently. And this was definitely one of the challenges of the build, because you can't just swap in the DSC module and expect it to work. In fact, the connector won't even line up, so there's no chance of you getting it to work without doing a complete rewiring of this harness up here and going pin by pin to make sure that we weren't getting any fault codes later, which we did, by the way, but that ended up being the DSC sensor that's inside of the cabin, which is a little bit different for the Xdrive cars, and so you'll see later in the video we rewired that as well. But back here in the engine bay, we had to add the N54 oil cooler, as well as change out the AC compressor hose, because that's a little bit different for the 335i. And then we went and cleaned up some of the pieces in the engine bay, as well as doing a little bit of painting because of some of the rust, and just trying to get a more uniform look inside of the engine bay. I really like to have my engine bays more sleeper, a little bit more blacked out. Now when this big box with blue tape arrived at my doorstep, that's when things got serious, because I ordered over $800 in supplies from FCP Euro in order to get started on phase 1 of servicing the motor. Everything from pulleys, belts, seals, transmission service parts, PCV hoses, things like that. They're all getting replaced as we put together the motor, because like I said, it's going to give us a lot better access while it's out rather than inside of the car. Now, if you want more details on how I built this car, I do have individual videos on my channel with all of the service items and modifications we did. Now, as you'll see here, I do end up removing the transmission to service the rear main seal while the engine's out, just because I figured this was safer than trying to get under that transmission on my garage floor and remove it to replace that seal. So we go ahead and service this thing because you see how much it's leaking. Looks like it's maybe never been changed before. Now, after we had replaced these seals, we had to deal with the broken bolts that were inside of the engine block from, I guess, the transmission maybe being over torqued before. And luckily, these bolts are aluminum stretch bolts, so they didn't exactly get stuck inside the block. Most of them came out just by spinning them out. But once we took care of this headache, we could go ahead and reassemble the transmission and start to work on getting the motor into the car. Now, I like to use these wooden dollies from Harbor Freight. They're dirt cheap, and somehow they're able to hold the weight of these motors, and it makes it easy enough for me to move the motors into position and then jack them up with a traditional jack and some jack stands and get them into place. Now, with the old engine out of the way, we go ahead and turn our attention to the N54, and I bought an engine harness to make sure that this engine ran correctly with my 2007 chassis, because the 2008 harness is a little bit different. And then we started on the rest of the service of all those items that we had purchased before, basically anything that was easier for us to change while the motor was out. And then once all that was done, we could go ahead and lift up the motor and subframe assembly into the car and get it bolted into place so that we could soon do our first test start. Now, similar to what we did in the front end of the car, we're going to go ahead and remove the rear subframes on both of these cars so that we can easily swap them over, and that way it saves us a lot of time instead of trying to manually pull off the differential, the axles, the calipers, and the rotors, all the things that are specific to the 335i that we want swapped onto our wagon. Now, I could have swapped over the 335i DMTL system, but I wanted to keep the single side exit exhaust because I thought that would be a cool sleeper component of this build. Now, while we have the rear subframe out, it's going to make a lot of sense for us to change out the subframe bushings, and instead of replacing them with the same old rubber bushings from factory, I decided to upgrade to these Powerflex polyurethane bushings, which are going to give us some increased performance, some stiffness in the rear of the car, as well as not having to replace these again, because polyurethane does not age nearly as fast as rubber. So we also installed some differential bushings as well. That's going to help us put the power down and reduce flex. And then I also changed the upper strut mount bushings to the ones from Powerflex as well. So everything back here is nice and solid. Now, piece by piece, we're putting the car back together, and one of the major differences between the rear-wheel drive and the Xdrive cars is the shifter assembly. So we went ahead and swapped that out, and then we went and serviced the transmission. Now, the transmission didn't look too bad. It didn't have any issues shifting. There was a little bit of this coloration in the oil, but you'd see this on any transmission, whether it's 100 or 200,000 miles. So it may have been serviced before, but we went ahead and serviced all the seals because it looked like maybe those hadn't been done, and just topped it off with fresh fluid. And then after that, we were able to turn our attention to the Xdrive adapter bracket. Now, like I said, the transmission tunnel is different on this car. It's actually wider to account for the transfer case for the Xdrive system. Now, when we go ahead and put a rear-wheel drive transmission in there, it doesn't fully fit the transmission tunnel, and so we have to make an adapter bracket that's going to hold the cross member instead of leaving it hanging in midair. So I said this before, and I'll say it again, I'm no fabricator, but I did enjoy making this, and I think it ended up working pretty well for us. And now at this point, we were basically really close to getting the car started for the first time. We just had to change out a couple of the remaining modules, like the instrument cluster and the CAS module, so that it would line up with the key. And then we were ready to fire it up and see what kind of noises it made. Now, after our first start and making sure that everything was running correctly, we were able to do some preliminary mods since it was a better time to do them now than to wait when the car was all back together. So I was lucky enough to partner with VRSF, and we installed some of the most common N54 mods that you can do on your 335 or 535i, and among those was the silicone inlets, which is pretty easy to do if you're able to lower your subframe, and the inlets are going to make sure that the air going to our turbos is nice and cool and consistent, and it helps with a little bit better flow considering that they're bigger than the factory plastic ones. We also did the VRSF charge pipe as well, which you need to do if you're going to be running any boost because the factory charge pipe is so known for breaking. And then we did the 5-inch intercooler as well, which doesn't require any modifications really. And then also the downpipes, which my car already came with, the donor car when we bought it. So all of these mods would prime the car for stage 2 tuning that we're going to be doing later. But first, one thing that I noticed was that I had the old steering column from my 2007, which was equipped with this steering lock, which they removed from production in 2008. So we went and did a steering column swap, and these things can cause issues later in life when the steering column lock starts to malfunction on its own. So it was better that we upgrade to the new column instead of keeping the old one, and then also installing the M Sport steering wheel. And with that all taken care of, we go ahead and take the car for its first drive. So surprisingly, the car ran really well, but as you could tell, it didn't have any exhaust installed because I hadn't yet fabricated one. So I decided to use the 335i front section and then the rear 325i exhaust section. So that would make it like a pretty sleeper system. And as you'll hear, it came out pretty well. Now at this point the car is running and driving. The rest of the mods and service that we do is simply to make this car a better build. Now we went and replaced the standard seats with the M Sport seats and at the same time cleaned up the carpets entirely. And then also while the seats were out, we had the opportunity to remove the transfer case module, which is over here under the passenger's seat. So I like to use a carpet cleaner by Bissell, and that does a great job of getting the stains out and also making the car smell a lot better. And then we went ahead and got the M Sport seats from our 335i, did a little bit of leather reconditioning, and then installed them in the car. So along with the M Sport seats and steering wheel, we had to retrofit the paddles because they don't just plug and play work in a non-M Sport car. It has to have a little bit of wiring done in order to work, and once that was done, the M Sport conversion was complete. Now, another large component of this build was doing all the Powerflex bushing upgrades. Not only do I feel like these are easier to install than a factory bushing, but they also have a longer service life and reduced flex, which is going to improve some of the handling feel. And specifically in the front of the car, these bushings perform or outperform the E90 M3 bushings. So we went and installed the sway bar bushings as well, front and rear, since the old ones were definitely starting to show their age. Another cool retrofit we got to do on this car was taking the Xdrive dashboard and all the related modules and swapping them into my wagon, because my wagon came as a single hump dashboard. So not only do you have to change out the dashboard, of course, but you do have to do some wiring, which is best to do while the dashboard is off. And once you've done all the wiring, it is also going to need to have some coating as well. So I definitely wouldn't recommend this retrofit for those of you that are just starting to do mods on your BMWs. But if you're familiar with doing, wiring and coating too, then I think this is something that you can handle at home, and the payoff is totally worth it because now you have all these extra features that are going to be enabled by the Xdrive system. Next up, in restoring this car, we decided to do some paint work. Now, again, just like fabrication wise, I'm not a painter at all, but I like to learn by doing. So I decided to get some paint stripper and try to strip off the paint off of all these pieces here. What really only worked out was the spoiler. The bumper didn't get as clean as I wanted, so I didn't end up painting that. And then the side mirrors were completely ruined, so I had to use my extra pair. So I went and taped off my garage, and then I followed basically all the steps that you should do when you're painting, as far as cars using an adhesion, primer, top layer, bottom layer, all these sort of things. And it actually came out pretty good, I'll say. The match of the color is really nice, and the clear coat came out really smooth as well. Now at this point, I still had some lights on the dashboard, specifically around the DSC system. So I investigated and found that the sensor, although I think the location was the same, the wiring was a little bit different between the all-wheel drive and the rear-wheel drive cars. So once I changed that out, we didn't have any more air lights on the dashboard. And so with that taken care of, we could move on to phase 2 of the engine service, where we lowered the subframe and serviced everything from the rod bearings to the motor mounts and then the turbos as well. Surprisingly, the rod bearings did not have a lot of wear on them, and considering that this engine had 200,000 miles, it was nice to see that we could just replace the bearings with some aftermarket King Performance ones and then move on to changing the turbos. For my choice of turbo replacements, I decided to go with the exact OEM TD03 size, and these ones I actually got off of eBay for a really good deal because I was curious as to how good these eBay turbos could really be. So we installed these to address the oil burning issue that was happening from the old turbos, and also at the same time we got to adjust the wastegates, replace all the lines and gaskets and seals around here to make sure that there wouldn't be any leaks in the future. And then with those turbos combined with our aftermarket mods, we are ready to do some tuning. So for our first run, we decided to load the factory map and see just how much power it made, and I was surprised to see that the car made 272 wheel horsepower and 290 wheel torque, and that's just about exactly where it should be for the factory tune on this motor. Then doing the Stage 2 Plus tune, we got 345 wheel horsepower and 450 wheel torque, which was a huge bump up in power, and I think the cherry on top for this build. So if you enjoyed watching, please go ahead and check out all the individual videos for this build on my YouTube channel, and be sure to subscribe if you love cool BMW content like this. As always, I hope everyone has an amazing day, and we will see you next time.